Mom always blamed Dad for ruining our family until I found hidden letters revealing she was the one who secretly cheated and destroyed our home years before everything fell apart forever. I never dreamed the truth about my family would show itself from an old box hidden away in the darkest corner of the attic. My mom had told me one thing that I remembered for as long as I could remember. My dad was the reason our family broke up. She said he was selfish, irresponsible, and that he abandoned us emotionally years before he really did leave. Her words painted such a vivid picture that it burned itself into my brain like a brand. I trusted her. I had to. What other choice did I have? I clung to that story as a child. It was the foundation of how I understood my childhood, my parents, and myself. My father was the villain in the tale, my mother the broken survivor struggling to hold the fragments together. But the more I held on to that tale, the more I felt estranged from both of them. Dad has not been present in years, and Mom? She was icy, piercing, and remote, as if bearing a secret I wasn't allowed to see. I want you to know I did not have a good childhood, but I did have moments, small flashes of heat. Dad had not always been gone, and Mom had not always been the bitter woman who blamed him for everything. There were mornings when I remember having breakfast with them at the kitchen table, all laughing together, the sun streaming through the window, the smell of coffee and pancakes filling the air. Memories such as these were like whispers of a different life, distant and fragile. But most days the silence was crushing. Mom's eyes would darken, and the house was thick with tension so heavy it seemed to hover around you. I was the middle child, sandwiched between the sharp words and the bitter resentment. At night, I'd lie awake listening to their hushed fights downstairs, words I was too afraid to acknowledge but knew meant everything. My safe haven was disappearing, and I didn't know why. When Dad departed, it was abrupt. One day, he was there, struggling with breakfast, trying to joke and smile. The next day, he was just gone. No enormous argument, no goodbye. Just silence. Mom explained to me that he had preferred himself to us. That he did not care. She repeated it repeatedly until I was certain it was truth. I'd hated him for so long. I'd hated the emptiness he left behind. But I'd also hated the way Mom's bitterness poisoned everything, including me. There was no room for forgiveness or understanding. Only blame. It wasn't until I was in my late 20s that everything changed. I'd gone back home for a weekend, the kind where old wounds feel like they're new again. The house also smelled the same, like a shut-up book with dust and untold stories. As I was rummaging in the attic, I found an old trunk worn out to the point of having rusty locks and frayed leather handles. I had never seen it. I was curious, and I opened it. They were bound in yellowed, tattered ribbons and appeared to be ordinary mail initially. But as I opened the letters and began to read, my heart thumped against my ribs. The handwriting was not that of my dad but my mom's. And they were not addressed to him, but another person, someone she had kept secret. The letters were filled with vows that had destroyed the truth I had known ever since I was born. I felt as though the floor beneath me had dropped away. I sat heavily onto the cold wooden floor, my shaking hands cradling the paper. My mind was whirling. Questions racing in like a tidal wave. Who was he? For how long? Why had she been lying? For the first time, I saw my mom not as the wounded woman who blamed Dad, but as a woman with secrets of her own, betrayals of her own. My head was spinning, but it was sure, the story which I had so long assumed to be true was only half the story. I read all the letters throughout the night, piecing together a timeline of deception and betrayal. The affair had commenced years earlier, even before I was born. There were mentions of secret trysts, plans for a future where she would set him free, and heartbreaks and regrets that weren't about Dad. The lady who accused Dad of breaking our family was herself partially responsible. It did break. The house was cold the next morning. I couldn't think of Mom in the same manner. I wanted to call her out, ask her why she'd betrayed my dad and us, but I was scared. The fear wasn't in what she'd done, it was in how fragile everything was. Would the family I'd left behind collapse completely if I broke the silence? I kept silent for weeks, weighed down by the letters like an unspoken wound. I'd occasionally find Mom staring at me distrustfully and somberly, as if she knew something was amiss but did not want to pry. One evening, I gathered the courage to inquire, "Mom, did you ever love Dad?" My voice barely rose above a whisper. She stepped aside, nibbling her lip, before she said, "You did. You really did. But sometimes love is not enough." Her answer haunted my mind. It showed me that love and betrayal go hand in hand. My mom's story was not simply about blame. It was a story of pain, regret, and choices born of despair. I struggled with whether to tell my siblings or go against my dad. The truth was a two-edged sword. Would it heal or only exacerbate the wounds? So I decided at last to talk to Dad first. Our discussion was blunt, uncomfortable. He neither denied nor admitted anything. Rather, he looked exhausted, beaten. He told me of the isolation, the years of pretending, of never wanting to go but thinking he had no choice. We didn't quite get everything straightened out that evening, but it was the start. For the first time, I was able to see Dad as a human being caught in the middle of a tempest, not the villain of Mom's story. This whole ordeal caused me to rethink what family was. It's complicated, it hurts, and it's messy. People aren't heroes or villains. They're broken, shattered at times, but still fighting. I have no idea if my mom will ever actually accept her part in tearing us down. Maybe that's not my call. But reading these letters, facing this truth, taught me to look beyond blame. To create space for pain on all sides. I'm still healing. But I'm learning to let go of anger and hold on to understanding. Because that's the only way to find peace in a family torn by secrets. After that first conversation with Dad, I felt like I had stepped through a doorway I wasn't sure I was ready to pass through. The house was quieter somehow, as if some heavy load had been lifted but had left an empty space behind it. I wanted to tell Mom what I had learned, but whenever I thought about doing it, my throat tightened and my hands trembled. How do you tell someone that everything they've accused another of, everything they've made you hate, may likely be their own guilt in disguise? Days turned into weeks, and I continued to replay the letters in my mind. I'd sit alone in my room, the dim light casting long shadows on the walls, with one of those thin envelopes in my hand, reading and rereading words written years earlier but echoing in my present. Her handwriting, so known and yet now so foreign, danced across the page like a letter I wasn't meant to read. I remembered one letter in particular. She'd written about a night she'd crept out of the house, out into the rain with this feeling of fear and urgency, to be with the man who wasn't Dad. She'd written about the way his hands had held her like she was fragile glass, the gentle whispers of promises they'd made, and how torn she was about the life she had at home. I could almost hear the rain hitting the window, smell the wet earth and the water in the air. It was that clear, that real. It made me sick. Not just because she cheated on Dad, but because I knew how lonely and desperate she must have been. I pictured her pacing back and forth in the living room in the middle of the night, the silence pressing down on her, the shame eating away at her like acid. Maybe she blamed Dad because she needed someone to carry the load, because she could not live with her own mistakes. I got out the letters that afternoon, while Mom was out running errands, this time to read them to hear if I could hear her voice beneath the blame and guilt. While I read, my phone buzzed with a text from my sister. She was home and wanted to meet up. I hesitated. Was I ready to tell her? To dismantle the story we'd both adopted? I met her at the old coffee house near where we grew up, the one where we'd shared secrets as teenagers, where we'd once dreamed of setting everything straight someday. When I told her about the letters, she went pale. There was silence for a long time, broken only by the soft tinkling of cups and the subdued hum of conversation around us. I always believed Dad was the bad guy, she whispered, her voice barely audible. But if Mom did this, why didn't we know? Why did she make us hate him so much? I shrugged, the weight of that question bearing down on me. I think she needed someone to blame. Maybe it was easier than facing the truth herself. We talked for hours, unraveling memories and emotions we'd buried for decades. She admitted she'd felt the same confusion, the same anger and grief, but never had the nerve to question Mom's version of things. For the first time, we both felt like we were seeing our family in a new way, flawed, to be sure, but human. When I got home that night, Mom was sitting in the living room, staring out the window. The house was quiet except for the distant whoosh of cars passing outside. I sat beside her, the letters heavy in my hand. "I know," I whispered. She didn't face me. "Know what?" "About the letters." "About everything." There was a long silence. Her shoulders shook, and I heard her breath catch as she fought not to cry. Then, hesitantly, she started to speak. "I never wanted you to find out this way. I was scared. Scared of losing you all, scared of what you'd think." Her voice cracked, and I saw a side of her I'd never witnessed, weak, vulnerable. I reached out and took her hand in mine. "We're not perfect," I said gently. "But maybe it's time we stop blaming each other and start figuring out what happens next." I didn't sleep well that night. My mind couldn't help but dwell on that moment, the mixture of pain and relief roiling inside of me like a storm. I realized that forgiveness wasn't forgetting or pretending that the past hadn't hurt. It was about accepting the truth, ugly and messy as it was, and choosing to move forward anyway. In the weeks that followed, things began to change. Impossible conversations were had, painful, awkward, but real. Mom and Dad spoke on the phone for the first time in years. I was there when Mom sobbed and apologized to Dad. It wasn't a solution, nothing about this was easy, but it was a beginning. I've learned that families are imperfect. People make mistakes. Sometimes those we love the most disappoint us deeply. But holding on to blame only keeps the wounds fresh. What matters is the courage to face reality, to own our pain, and to find a way to heal. Now, when I read those letters, I don't just see betrayal. I see a woman who was lost and broken and trying to find her way. I see a family that was torn apart by secrets, but not irreparably. I'm still working on forgiving. Still working on trusting. Still working on believing that even during the very worst times, there's hope. Because in the end, family isn't about perfection. It is about choosing love, even when it's hard. The weeks after that conversation were like driving through a fog. Everything I thought I knew was shifting beneath my feet, and yet I had to continue on anyway. I understood that healing wasn't linear. There were days when I felt closer to peace. Other days, the fury blasted up in me once more, fast and primal, biting at me like a wave crashing over me. I remember one afternoon in specific. I lounged on the worn couch in the living room, the letters spread out in a scattering across the coffee table in front of me like pieces of a broken puzzle. The sun shone through the curtains, casting a warm, honey-colored light that seemed to clash with the cold spasm churning my stomach. Mom came in quietly, sitting down next to me in silence. We sat there in silence for a moment, two people carrying the burdens of years. Then she reached out and took one of the letters, tracing her shaking fingers over the worn-out ink. I never thought I'd ever set eyes on these again. She breathed. Her voice was barely audible, scarcely more than a whisper. I thought I could bury it all and pretend it never happened. I looked at her, really looked at her, and for the first time, I noticed the cracks in her armor. The fear, the regret, the loneliness, it was all there, raw and human. "Why did you not tell us?" I insisted, my voice shaking. "Why did you keep it a secret all this time?" She took a deep breath, and I could see the tears welling up in her eyes. I was scared. Scared that if I said I told the truth, I'd lose everything, my family, your trust. And maybe, on some level, I didn't want to accept that I made those errors. I wanted to blame him instead. It was simpler. Her honor was a slap to me. It wasn't so much the betrayal that hurt, but watching her suffer too, trapped in her own loop of shame and denial. We talked all that day, of the past, of pain, of forgiveness. I unleashed my rage and frustration, my fear that our family could never be made whole again. She listened to me, really listened to me, without defending herself or breaking in. It was the most honest dialogue we'd had in years. Slowly, the distance that separated us began to shrink. It did not remove the hurt, but it made room for something else, understanding. For the first time, I felt we were on the same side, working to heal rather than tear each other asunder. I also called Dad more often. Our conversation at first was stilted, with silence and unspoken words, but eventually it became a lifeline. He told me about the loneliness he had felt when Mom's heart had wandered off from him, how he had struggled to retain it for the family but eventually broke under its pressure. I wasn't perfect, he said to me one evening, voice heavy with regret. I made mistakes too. But quitting wasn't what I wanted. It was how I knew how to keep living. That he would say that dismantled some of the black and white story I'd clung to for so long. People aren't black and white. They're complicated, broken, and flawed, just like families. One night, I was out in the yard, gazing up at the stars, feeling small and lost. The night wind was cool and smelled of wet earth and pine, and far away, crickets sang through the stillness. I thought about all the things that we'd been through, the secrets, the lies, the pain, and I didn't know if we could ever quite get past it. But then I realized that maybe getting over it wasn't the plan. Maybe it was a question of learning to coexist with the scars, whether they reminded us how far we'd come. And I also learned that forgiveness is not an endpoint. It's a journey, one requiring patience, courage, and sometimes, a willingness to sit with hurt. I started writing once more, bleeding my feelings onto the page, trying to make sense out of the chaos inside me. Writing became a healing, a processing, a searching for sense amidst the chaos. The letters that once seemed like chains keeping me grounded to the past slowly began to become a bridge to my parents, to the truth, and to myself. I won't fix everything now. There are still times when the pain hits hard, when I wonder if we'll ever repair what was damaged. But there is hope. Hope that even the deepest wounds can heal. And through it all, I'm learning that love, messy, complicated, imperfect love, is still worth fighting for. The next year was more of a gradual unraveling and reweaving of all of the threads of my family. Nothing was overnight. No moment swept us up in miraculous forgiveness or instant peace. Instead, it was a gentle, slow process, one conversation at a time, one step after another. I remember one night when Mom and I sat at the kitchen table long after dishes were done. The house was quiet except for the hum of the refrigerator and the occasional creak of the old wooden floor. She opened up more than she ever had before, about her regrets, her fears, the loneliness that had prompted her to make choices she hated. For the first time, I didn't hear blame or bitterness. I just heard a woman trying to describe her pain. I was scared of being alone, she said, voice low and raw. Scared that if I stayed, I'd be trapped in a life where no one really loved me. I made terrible mistakes because I was desperate. Her words hit me hard, not because they justified anything, but because they made her real, vulnerable, broken, but human. I told her of the nights I'd wept, trying to understand why everything had fallen apart. Of the agony of loving and hating her at the same time. Of how the letters changed everything I'd assumed. She leaned across the table and took my hand, squeezing it gently. I'm sorry, she whispered. For all of it. And in that moment, something shifted. The years of silence, rage, and blame didn't disappear, but a fragile strand of healing began to take hold. I also made peace with Dad on my own terms. We did not become best buddies or erase the past, but I no longer saw him as just the man who had walked out on us. I saw a father who loved us imperfectly, who suffered so much, and who, like the rest of us, made mistakes. We talked about how to move forward, not by pretending the past never was, but by making new memories without the specters of old pain. I asked him to come for family dinners, awkward and tentative at first, but each one chipped away at the walls decades of silence had built. My siblings and I saw the complexity of our parents, flawed individuals who had loved us in their own fashion, even when it hurt. I learned that family is not perfection or fairy tales. Family is accepting each other, good, bad, and ugly, and choosing to move forward, even when it feels impossible. I look back now and see how far I've traveled. The anger that once burned so hot in me has tempered into compassion. The pain is still there, but it no longer defines me. I have the scars of my family's story, but they remind me not of brokenness alone, but of resilience. One day, I hope to write my own letter, not to anyone else, but to myself. A letter of forgiveness, acceptance, and hope. A promise to hold on to the lessons learned without holding on to the weight of blame. Because that's what this journey has taught me, the truth, no matter how painful, can set us free, if we're brave enough to face it. And love, even when it's messy and flawed, is still worth holding on to. Now, when I look at my family, I see more than a story of blame and betrayal. I see people who hurt, who made mistakes, but who also fought to find their way back. And that changes everything.